Okay, in this video I'm doing several part series. I don't know how many parts this is going to be. It's going to be several. But I'm talking basically about the scientific evidence for God, and in this series I'm talking about basically the beginning of the universe and how it relates to the existence of God. Now, in the last video, I talked about dark energy, and later on I'm going to get to dark matter. But in this, I wanted to finish this one out as far as the universe beginning as being one of the best evidences for God. And I think most students today, they have no idea, or they don't really care, I don't think atheist evolutionists really care about what I would call the history of science and the history of the Big Bang Theory. But for right now, I'm going to stop right here, and I'm going to show a 5-minute clip on the idea, what it meant anyway, scientifically and historically scientifically, that the belief that the universe actually had a beginning and its repercussions on the scientific community at the time.
During the 1920s, two of the most important discoveries in the history of science were made here at the Mount Wilson Observatory overlooking Los Angeles. For 8 years, astronomer Edwin Hubble photographed and studied the cosmos with the largest telescope in the world. In 1923, Hubble confirmed that mysterious formations called nebulae, widely believed to be enormous clouds of gas, stars, and dust within the Milky Way, were actually individual galaxies located far beyond our own. 5 years later, he verified that these galaxies were moving away from each other at fantastic speeds. Our universe, long thought to be eternal, static, and relatively small, was growing larger by the second. The implications were staggering. If the universe is continually expanding, then at some point early in its history, it must have been smaller and more compact.
If you reverse the outward motions of the galaxies and go backward in time, they come closer and closer together, and you reach a point finally where they're nearly infinite in density and temperature, and farther than that you can't go. So there is a beginning, there is a point in time from which it all started. And that's a remarkable thing because it has a very strong theological flavor to it. And that intrigued me because I am an agnostic, and if there was a beginning, a moment of creation in the universe, then there was a creator. And a creator is not compatible with agnosticism. And just as I can't believe that there was a creator, I can't believe that this all happened by chance, which implies there was a creator. So you see, I'm in a completely hopeless bind, and I've stayed there.
Robert Jastro's uncertainty was fueled by multiple discoveries that pointed to a universe created out of nothing and governed by laws of physics and chemistry, finely calibrated to ensure complex life.
Life is so extraordinary, especially advanced life, intelligent life. Conscious beings are such an extraordinary phenomenon that, again, I just qualitatively find it difficult to believe that they happened by chance. Think of your brain, for example. It's 3 pounds of matter, contains 1,000,000 trillion synapses, as I recall, circuits opening and closing all the time. It's so much more complicated than the most advanced artificial intelligence. Again, I find it hard to believe that this is all a matter of atoms and molecules. And so I try to fit into my concept of the world the conclusion that there is a larger force of some kind, which we can call God, or you can call it whatever. But I can't accept that. I'm what's called a materialist in philosophy. That doesn't mean I like Cadillacs and big cars. My students always used to think that. It means that I believe the world consists entirely of material substances. And when you specify those substances, the atoms and molecules, and the laws by which they interact, you've done it all. There isn't anything more to be said or inserted into your model of the universe. That's what my science tells me, and I've been a scientist all my life, but I find it unsatisfactory. In fact, it makes me uneasy. I feel I'm missing something, but it will not. I will not find out what I'm missing within my lifetime.
Robert Jastrow died in 2008. As the founder of NASA's Goddard Space Institute and the director of the Mount Wilson Observatory, he helped to popularize astronomy throughout the world. In his best-selling book, God and the Astronomers, Jastrow described the philosophical conflict between scientific materialism and evidence for a universe that had a beginning. Far from disproving the existence of God, astronomers may be finding more circumstantial evidence that God exists, that the universe began abruptly in an act of creation. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries.
Okay. Now, as you saw in the video, Robert Jastrow, he's an agnostic. He doesn't want to believe in God. He does not want to believe that there's a God. He's agnostic. But even though he says he's an agnostic, in other words, an agnostic usually means you don't know whether there's a God or not. And it doesn't necessarily mean because you don't believe or you don't know that there's a God, you're necessarily, you have angst against it. But in Robert Jastrow's case, and I would say in most of the cases that I've seen, I have a clip from Brian Cox, the physicist, who talks about how unsatisfactory it is that the universe began. What caused the universe? But he uses the word unsatisfactory. Well, of course, for an atheist, it's unsatisfactory that the universe began. But for a theist, it's not unsatisfactory. Now, again, let's talk about the history of science. Well, before 1905, when Einstein came up with his special relativity in 1905, and then later on he came up with general relativity. But anyway, with those relativity equations, that began to start tearing down the wall of what they call the steady state theory, because even Einstein in his day, which he did not like the fact that his own equations were saying that, or were implicating that the universe could not be static. It had to be dynamic. And so he put a value in his equations called the cosmological constant, and it was an arbitrary value that he picked. He tried to find, you might say, figure out the true value later on, but he picked a value for his cosmological constant that would give you a steady state. Why? Because philosophically at that time they believed in the steady state universe, and in fact they would chide Christians. Well, you Christians say that God is eternal. Well, we claim that the universe, matter and energy, are eternal. And, of course, if the universe, matter, and energy are eternal, then the Bible's wrong from the very beginning. In fact, they loved the fact that the universe was eternal, because then they didn't have to worry about evolution. Because with an eternal universe, they had plenty of time. They had infinite time, in fact. They had more time than they needed. They didn't even have to worry about, quote, 13.6 billion years ago that they have to worry about today, which when you hear them talk, they never worry about it anyway. But anyway, but the time period was dramatically shortened, and it took from 1905 until 1993 for the Big Bang model to become the accepted model. Well, why did it take so long? Well, I have a little a history that I put together, and when I put it together, somebody claimed or accused me of copying, pasting it from somebody else. It's interesting when I debate atheists, they think I don't have any education, so I can't think like this, right? Well, I wrote this. I put this all together myself. I did a lot of research and I put it all together myself. So starting in 1905, of course, like we talked about with Einstein's equations of relativity, there was an implication that the universe was either expanding or contracting. There was an astronomer named Arthur Eddington in 1919 who observationally confirmed that the theory of relativity was true. And then in 1924, there was a Russian mathematician named Alexander Friedmann, and he realized that the universe, because of the theory of relativity, could be in expansion, contraction, or oscillating between them both, okay? Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble noticed, he was an astronomer at Mount Wilson Observatory, and he saw what they call the redshift of galaxies, which just means that because the galaxies looked redshifted, they must be moving away from us. Well, between 1927 and 1931, there was a Catholic Belgian priest called George Lemaitre, and he took Einstein's equations and Edwin Hubble's observations, and he came up with the idea of the Big Bang. So, in 1931, it wasn't until 1931 that his paper was published in English. Now, you can take three guesses why a Catholic priest was ignored from 1927 to 1931 when he first proposed the Big Bang Theory. I wonder why. Because of its implications, of course. In 1948, you had Ralph A. Alpher and George Antonovich Gamow, George Gamow. So Ralph Alpher and George Gamow, they postulated, okay, so if there was a Big Bang, there should be some kind of what they call afterglow, the heat left over from the Big Bang. They called that the microwave background radiation. That was just a prediction they made in 1948. Same year, Sir Fred Hoyle, he was an English astronomer, and Thomas Gold and Hermann Bode, they began to argue for the universe being in a steady state. And in 1949, Sir Fred Hoyle, he coined the term Big Bang, but it was a term he coined in derision against the Big Bang because, of course, he believed in the steady state theory. But in 1965, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, they accidentally find the microwave background radiation. Now, this by no means settled the science at all. This was just their first observational evidence that there was such a thing as the microwave background radiation, which is, again, just the heat left over from the Big Bang explosion. So in 1978, a man named Robert Jastrow, the guy you saw in the video that I played, he wrote a book called God and the Astronomers, and he explained all the science at the time, and he also explained his colleagues' all-around disgust at the Big Bang Theory. So he was noticing that, evidence shouldn't upset a scientist. Evidence should not upset a scientist unless, of course, you're, quote, rooting for certain science. And all this time, that's exactly what was happening. Even Einstein did not like the fact that the universe could be expanding or contracting. Why? Because it sounds too much like Bible, and that means that the universe had a beginning. All these scientists, all the way down, most of them were against the Big Bang Theory. But in 1993, they sent up a satellite called the COBE satellite, the Cosmic Background. I can't remember the name of the E. It's an interesting name, but anyway, it's the COBE satellite, and it mapped the background radiation. And so I remember I was 1993. I'm not going to give away my age, doesn't matter. But I was watching a guy named Ted Koppel on a program called Nightline. He had a nighttime news program. And on that program, he put up Genesis 1:1. Why? Because the microwave background radiation was confirmed. The prediction was made, again, by George Gamow, right, in 1948, that if there was a Big Bang, there should be the heat signature left over, and they found it. So, then in 2003, they sent up another satellite called the WMAP. It confirmed it again to a greater degree. In fact, what's interesting about these different satellites is the microwave background radiation is interesting because of one thing. It showed that the universe, when it began, it was only 1/50,000th of a degree from one side of the universe to another off. It's like, what? 1/50,000th of a degree. You know, in a room, a small room, you could have 2 or 3 degrees difference in temperature. And but the microwave background radiation is so uniform, it only varies by 1/50,000th of a degree. In fact, some people say it's 1/100,000th of a degree, but I'll stick with 1/50,000th of 1 degree. Doesn't matter. So then in 2003, there was also the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, or they call it the BGV theorem, which is a theorem in physical cosmology, which says that any universe that has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a space-time boundary. It must have a beginning. So even if there is a multiverse, which again, I'll leave links in the description below. The multiverse is not science in 2021. But even if there is a multiverse, you still have to have some kind of fine-tuning, and you have to have a beginning to the multiverse generating machine out there that's supposedly churning out all these particular other universes, if there is such a thing as a multiverse. But again, there's no evidence the multiverse exists. It's a fairy tale. And then lastly, in 2018, they sent up the Planck CMB probe again, which confirmed the science and also confirmed the microwave background radiation. And at one point, when I debate atheists, they always love to bring up what they call the logical fallacies. And I was accused of the logical fallacy of ignorance. It's an argument from ignorance. Well, this isn't an argument from ignorance. If anybody's arguing from the point of ignorance, it would be the atheist, not me. This is all science. And again, what makes it so believable is this. Most of the scientists were kicking and screaming into the Big Bang Theory. They did not want it to be true. Why? It sounds too much like Bible. That's why. They understood the implications of it. And for some reason, I don't know of anybody that's taught this stuff. This is actual science. This is all science. This is the actual scientists themselves. And it was their discoveries. What I do appreciate about all these gentlemen that put all of this together is, even though they came kicking and screaming into it, even Sir Fred Hoyle, who made a theory, made the steady state theory into a theory, even he had to abandon his own theory based upon the scientific evidence that we have. Now, so you have to, as an atheist, as an evolutionist, you have to deal with the fact that the universe began. And again, your multiverse is not an option. It is not science. It cannot be tested in a lab. Alan Guth says we might be able to know the answer in 100 years, but that's 100 years from now. But what we do know from the science is the universe began. And like even Brian Cox said, it may be unsatisfactory for you atheists, but there has to be a cause for the universe. And what's more likely? What's more probable? What's more reasonable to believe? That all the vast universe came from an actual nothing. And again, in that video that I showed you at the very beginning, Arno Penzias, there was a quote from Arno Penzias that he believes that the universe actually came from nothing. That's scientifically impossible. Scientifically impossible that the universe came from nothing at all. That is scientifically impossible. Logically, that's illogical. But it's okay if you guys throw out logic. But by definition, an atheist, now again, I'm talking about a hard atheist. I know there's many definitions of atheists, and they say, oh, stop right there. You don't know what you're talking about. Atheism is a lack of belief and all that baloney. The atheist experience guys have stopped using that one. But if you're a hard atheist, you don't believe in the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause, the first cause. You don't believe in that. And by definition, you've ruled out one of the possibilities. So who's the winner in this? Genesis 1:1 is. The universe did have a beginning, and hardly nobody denies that now. Now, they're trying to get around it with theories like the eternal inflation model, but again, eternal inflation model of the expanding universe. But again, that is a theory. That has not been proven. It cannot be proven. Again, it might take, like Alan Guth said, maybe 100 years before it's proven. But right now, guess who wins? God wins. And Genesis 1:1 is back. Thank you.